I suspect we either crazy or committed to be out on a night like this, and I hope it's the first that we are the committed line. I'm delighted to be here, I really am. I actually have half a foot in St. John's Parish since I was baptized there up on the hill, so I don't feel totally alien from the environment at all, so thank you. Just bear with me. I know that Christians' hackles rise at the very mention of Harry Potter. And I know that the word magic has no room in the Christian lexicon. I know this, but I was nonetheless rather taken with the comment of J.K. Rowling on the morning after the Brexit vote when she said, "I did not think I wanted magic more." And last week, the office for which I work held a colloquium with Dr. Makosi Khoza, who is chairing the ad hoc committee tasked with finding the new public protector. And twice during that discussion, she said quite categorically, South Africa is in a moral leadership credibility crisis. There is a loss of faith in the administrative processes and systems, and there is little trust in the people elected to represent them. And I am going to ask tonight that we hold those two thoughts in our minds and in our hearts, because I suspect that at a very kind of guttural, emotional level, a lot of people want some magic in the body politic. A lot of people want something to happen that will inspire, that will give hope, that will open up new possibilities, that will engage differently. And a lot of people feel the weight of the pathologies that our country holds at this time, and sense that the core of those pathologies is the crisis in leadership. The crisis in moral leadership, the crisis in creativity in leadership, the crisis in integrity and honesty, and that, I think, speaks for the lethargic feel that we have in this country at the moment. And people feel it from all ends of the spectrum. People feel it in all different domains in which they interact. And I want to suggest that part of the reason that this election has taken on the profile of a referendum is because so much of that need, that desire for magic, and so much of a way of envisioning a way out of the crisis rides on the back of this election. And so it's of huge import for this country how these elections turn out and what they signal. I think it does mean that, and for us, I think, as people of faith, amidst the anxiety and the excitement and the noise of the electioneering campaigns, we, as a people of faith, also want to discern afresh with a new vitality, with a new sense of urgency and of hope. We want to discern our responses and not be, as Paul reminds the Colossians, not be taken captive by the empty philosophies and deceptions that the world offers. Because when we are in a bind, it's easy to fall prey to those forces. So we have an obligation to explore. And that's why I'm hoping to throw out a few disconnected, vague ideas tonight, and hope that they'll promote some engagement, not because you will necessarily learn anything, but because I keep being asked what I think about the elections, and I hope that some kind of great answer will emerge from this discussion tonight, so that I'm the one who goes having learnt greatly. In the scheme of things, I think just to put it out there, in the scheme of things, for those who remember the endless discussions around the shape of this country, around the polity that this country was going to take on after 94, one of the great insights of the framers of our political platforms understood that municipalities were going to be the cold face of governance and promote socio-economic development and the delivery of basic services. Their location within communities, and I've put that little thought down, their location within communities is strategically important, particularly to institutionalize the connection between government, which is often very amorphous and distant, and the governed. They really, if you like, and I like the phrase so I use it often, they localize. Municipalities are meant to localize democracy. Therefore, the fact that the highest turnout for any local election, where there is the possibility of accountability, of engagement, and the practice of democracy, that the highest turnout we've ever had in a local election was the last one, and that was 57.6%, points to a very low trust deficit in the democratic process, and a very low level of expectation that governance and socio-economic delivery can take place in that domain. And therefore, and what we're seeing it more and more, there's a fundamental disengagement with the democratic processes, and very often from any kind of governance. And it can thus be expected that other forms of pressure will be exerted. And in the absence of results from government, those pressures take the form of increasingly violent forms of engagement with the system. And that is worrying in the extreme. I want to suggest this evening that what makes the present election probably somewhat different from any that have gone before, and what we need to factor into our thinking around this election, that there are three things that have not been part of the political landscape up to now, as far as I can make out. The first is the ANC. There are multiple starting points for trying to understand the ANC, and there are diverse considerations to bear in mind when assessing the ANC. And nobody can do justice to them all, and I'm not going to. But these are just a few points. There are others, obviously, and we join the dots differently. And whether one comes from a position of fundamental support for that party, or whether one is in opposition to it at different levels, makes very little difference. The concern, I think, is central to all people who think, because for South Africa, the ANC is central. Whether we like it or not, it is the government that carries a huge amount of popular support. 62% of people in Parliament have been elected in a series of fair and free elections, and they carry that kind of support. And so the amount of political and social leverage that they have within the multiple systems of governance is huge. And without the goodwill of the ANC, many argue, nothing will actually happen. And so the party is there. I saw two different assessments recently, and at least for the next two elections. And therefore, what happens within that party affects all of us. What happens within that party is an indication of all of our fates. Our fates are inexorably linked, as it were. Oh, I've got the same page twice. I hope I've got page 2 as well. I don't know, as I said, what to say particularly about the ANC. But I do know this, and I don't think it's disputed by anybody, that this election will be the first opportunity all round to check whether the recent shifts in the ANC and the exposed agendas which have particularly come tumbling to the fore since the Nene event, since the Nkandla event, since the charges being restored, those things and others are very important. There's never been a moment when the ANC could assess the impact of that. This is going to be the first moment of assessment. And therefore, the efforts to contain the pressure and the energy and the fallout is huge. So it's the first time we're going to have a sense of what people on the ground think of that. The fallout within the ANC and the growing distrust between the two key factions in the ANC is starting to play out very visibly and very violently. Much is at stake, not least financially and in terms of security, and therefore there is a real anxiety building up in the ANC around where this is going to land eventually. The two wings, the two contesting wings for the soul of the ANC, the traditionalists as they're called, led by the man whom they call number 1, and others have ruder names which I can never mention in the church community or any community, but that man, but the president and the Premier League, those premiers that he has around them, and basically the KZN area, and that is not insignificant because of the paid up membership of the ANC. 21% of that membership is in KZN. So between all the other provinces, the rest is divided. So in the way the polity of the ANC works and the democratic structures, it's the paid up members in branches who get representation at the national conference, and they're the ones who vote for the incoming president. So you can see the absolute urgency of finding where that particular group lay. The reformists, as they are called, led by Cyril Ramaphosa and Gauteng, are the group that more closely associated with with policy cohesion. They're known as the Social Democrats. They're ideologically more flexible and are mostly middle class with very little hold in the rural areas where the traditionalists, with their more socially conservative and culturally conservative agendas, hold sway. You see the politics shifting. For those of you who've been watching the SABC, what's the word, debacle? I'm conscious that I'm being taped. As that is being played out, just the events over the last 24 hours of the turnabout of the ANC towards what's his name? Him. Is remarkable, and it's remarkable because Gauteng have put up a barrier, and they will not take any more discussion around it. And they say no. And in order to keep that important vote, the ANC has had to do some dancing and very quickly revise their position. So one can see how the battle for the soul of the ANC and for the strong showing at the 2017 conference will be tested out in this election. So for the ANC, there's a huge amount at stake. Analysts have pointed out, you've probably read some of it, that the last similar fractious kind of internal politicking was in the early 1950s, which eventually led to the PAC breaking away. And as a number have pointed out, at that time, the fracture was around ideology, around a way forward, around expanding understandings of freedom. It gave rise to that vibrant political culture, one that I grew up in, where you went to bed late at night because you were discussing the relative positions of insurrectionists versus nationalists versus those who were more aligned to a class analysis. And there's none of that debate now. Now the fracture is around entitlement, around risks to be avoided in order to continue acquiring, and like big business, understanding that acquisition can only happen in a stable political environment. And so that whole notion of trying to ensure a stability in order to practice the kind of politics of scavenging is really at the forefront for some direction. And the problem is, and we've been following the kind of polls quite recently, the problem is that the seepage from the ANC is not from the ranks, it is from the ranks of the reformists. So all seepage from the ANC actually strengthens President Zuma's position, because there's no seepage happening in the areas where he's strongest. The areas where the reformists are strongest is where the towel is being thrown in. And so for many of my friends, how they vote in Gauteng is actually quite a crisis for them. Not wanting to vote to shore up the present situation, and yet knowing that an alternative can only emerge, an alternative that we need to have, credible alternative going forward, can only emerge if they are actually voting and canvassing in that area. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff happening. But I could talk all night about the ANC, and some would argue it's not worth it. There are many, and then of course, for the opposition parties, this is also going to be quite a critical moment, because the growth of a spirit of opposition is very vocal and very robust in the public domain, but we do often live in our own echo chambers. We often live in environments where we hear what we think already and hear it amplified. And so there isn't a real sense of where glass ceilings have occurred. There's no way of assessing until after these elections, for instance, what the real strength of the EFF is. The last time round, it was an angry anti-ANC vote by a particular grouping. We don't know how many branches exist and what kind of policy formulations they have to take it forward. We don't know if that is going to translate into greater support. Two polls recently have suggested that their support is amongst people who are not of an age to vote yet, and therefore the full stadia is not a trustworthy indication. And the same is true of there is no way of assessing just at the moment, even though there's a huge amount of optimism, there's no way of assessing whether a significant inroad has been made into the black middle class by the DA. They say it is, and they speak quite confidently of the following in places like Orange Farm, but it's yet to be seen whether that translates. So everyone has a huge stake in this election and ensuring that it happens. Ideologically, the dominant discourse is around what kind of economic framework will come into place. And there's an unusual meeting of minds with the reformist ANC and the DA on this, and a curious kind of playoff against each other with the traditionalists in the ANC and the EFF. And so the possibility at this critical point where we're gearing towards these 6-monthly ratings by the ratings agencies, we run the risk of seeing the traditionalists try and position themselves in a quite radical economic narrative in order to play off against the EFF, and that will have a whole set of repercussions for the country. It's partly why that group feels the need to get rid of Minister Pravin Gordhan, and those efforts have increased of late. He's very vulnerable in his position at the moment, and with that, I would argue, the country. So that's the one kind of dynamic that I think is going to, why this election holds such a thrall for people, because there are a whole lot of unknowns and questions that need to be answered that we have no clue as to where to locate the relative strength. And this will be the first, the first opportunity we have. And for people who work in supporting political parties, there's not a very long time between this election and the national and provincial elections. And so it is important. The second area that is new in a sense is the beginnings of a kind of perception, and we all know in politics just how strong perceptions are, but the question mark that hangs over the IEC. The IEC has always been the golden child of our democratic institutions, and rightly so. And the problem lies partly in the fact that there has not been a thorough working out of the various court cases since 2013 till the 2 weeks ago in what is generally called the clockware scenario. The ramifications of those court cases and of the Constitutional Court's decisions have not been worked out fully. There are gaps. And the EFF have made it known that the that they will challenge any and everything. Part of their strategy overall is that all institutions need to be challenged. Now they do a pretty good job about that in Parliament, but it's less clear how they can do that with the IEC, except in what is being called lawfare, where they will take every dispute to law. And they will block the courts and block the processes and leave as a kind of vulnerable situation people who have been elected. So that you'll always be wondering if the next court decision will confirm your position or render your position or nullify your position. And that leaves a kind of vacuum. It disables governance from happening quite profoundly. So a huge amount, and I serve as an electoral code of conduct commissioner, and a huge amount of additional effort has been put into the maintenance and the trying to ensure that the procedural aspects of this election are totally secure. And that, I think, will happen. It's very difficult to put 3,000 extra votes in a box or to allow the dead to vote. Now, I know that theologically the dead live, and all of that stuff is true, and I believe it. But I know when it comes to voting, my belief is a less secure one. But I do trust that that's what's happened in Zimbabwe, so it can happen anywhere else, I suppose, if the dead rise to vote. But the fact that there is a certain amount of uncertainty, the parties will exploit. The parties that have been around generally don't exploit those kinds of things. They take their victories and their gains and they run with it, happy that they've got some. But I don't think we know whether the EFF will do the same, and there's a huge amount of disquiet around that, both in the intelligence services, also in the ISC, but also just in people's hearts. And when we begin to have a sense of fear in what should be a celebration of democracy, then we begin to eat away at the fabric of our hard-won democracy, and that, I think, is worrying. And added to this, of course, has been the fact that the appointment of Glenn Mashineni as the chair of the IEC, having come from being the special advisor to President Zuma, doesn't inspire lots of people with great confidence. It has to be said that he seems to have been and I think he knows he's been watched, and he seems to have been remarkably kind of non-partisan, and let's hope that that is in fact his position, because it's a necessary position. The third area that is different this time is the high levels of violence and the intensity of the protests. Hitherto, we have a history of service delivery protests or social activism, and they always are visible. Not if Claudia gets his way, of course, at the SABC, they won't be anymore, but generally they are visible and people know about them. Always, without exception, till 2014, those protests have subsided in election years. There's a fundamental kind of understanding that this is the time that politicians are canvassing. This is the time that they are likely to make compromises, that they're likely to make offers, that they're likely to do things. It's the one time when you can engage politicians and parties on a one-to-one basis, and we've found all through the history of this country that protests subside. 2014 began to change that pattern, and this year we've had infinitely more protests and more violent protests than we've had before. What that says is that there is this disengagement with the political processes. People do not necessarily feel that engaging politicians in an election year is going to yield anything, that it offers them anything, that it's worth following up on, because the returns have been so meager. And in fact, what is beginning to happen is that the engagement is now with more, I don't say reckless, but I mean that in a nuanced way, non-organized forces in communities that have their own roots, that have their own securities, and very often those are linked to the criminal world, to syndicates, and this begins to come to the fore. And so that tradition, that strategy of working with, of eking out concessions, of engaging people in an electoral year now seems to be dissipating. And it's particularly acute when you find, as happened last week before, after the Tswane protests, where you bring out senior political leadership who make the correct call for lawful engagement, but each of whom themselves have a recent history of unlawful behavior. So the Minister of Defense speaks admirably about the need to act lawfully, that there are procedures, that there are ways of resolving this, and the press say to her, yeah, well, that's great that you're calling for lawful resolution, but you brought in an illegal person with no documentation into the country, and not apologized for that. If anybody else had come to a border post without documentation, they would not have been flown at the state's expense to a ministerial home. So the already volatile situation and the disengagement is, I think, further pushed back by the failure to have role models and people who can be trusted, and people who can say, I am saying this and trust me because I have been trustworthy. When you don't have that in the political domain, the deficit of trust decreases, and the space for lawlessness at all levels and in many different configurations increases. So those are the three things that I think need to be taken into account and need to be part of the lens through which we see this election. You know, you don't need to agree with it, but my thoughts as to why I will watch the elections a little bit more carefully. And so what do Christians do who want to heed that injunction of Paul to the Colossians, not to be taken captive by the empty philosophies and the delusions of the world? I've been surfing a number of Christian sites that range from far this way and far that way, to see where people are positioning, or what the key issues that people feel in faith need to be addressed. And I've found 3 trends. I love the word trending. I don't exactly know what it means, but it sounds very nice. And so I use trending wherever I can. And you normally get told by 5-year-old nephews that that's exactly used in the wrong way. But I say I've been speaking English longer than you, so you must understand that I have the right understanding of the word. Firstly, I think there's a much deeper emphasis in on Christian sites and in things I've been reading about using the vote as a means of indicating pleasure and displeasure. The vote as a censure for bad political moral behavior and a reward for good behavior. It's a different kind of language from the prophetic kairos type language that has undergirded much of our engagement as faith communities at times of elections. And you can go through most of the major mainline churches have put out statements before election, and it has had that the more prophetic kairos type style language, and it's been very useful and very necessary. But now we're seeing a lot more almost restricted language saying, you know, the real issue here is reward good behavior, good political behavior, good moral behavior, and censure bad behavior. Doesn't matter where you find it, who it is, that's what we need. It's no use speaking a language of a prophetic church when in fact the basics aren't in place and you need to get those basics right. So I'm seeing a lot of that happening, and the understanding that in local elections one can hold individuals accountable. It isn't PR lists where it is the party who puts forward candidates. Here there is somebody for whom you actually vote, and you can hold that person accountable, and there is a need to restore responsible political behavior and undergird and strengthen a democratic political culture. So that's the one thing I'm seeing. And it's across a fairly wide range of faith voices. The second thing is a real kind of putting under the spotlight the call to do away with a false dichotomy between the political parties we choose and the decisions taken by these parties. And so there is a call and a challenge to, well, firstly acknowledge that we empower parties to act on our behalf. And thus, if their actions betray our values and the reasons we put them into power, we should censure them. And the sense of being committed, as it were, to the manifesto, because the manifesto holds good ideals, needs to be read alongside political behavior, and that it's our responsibility, because we vote them into power. We should be holding them to a much greater account. And the third area that I'm seeing, and it's interesting, might I just say that this area, and even the other two, are being reflected also in the language of faith communities in the United States in the run-up to the election there, and were partly also in view in some circles in the Brexit discussion. And that the third area is that we really need to stop giving allegiance to a leader and to give it to good leadership. Madiba, interestingly, always spoke out against the cult of leaders. And there are endless clips of people saying, but as a leader, and he said, no, I'm one of a leader. I'm one of a collective of leaders. And he got that right, I think, that we need to stop the adulation of leaders and really be committed to building up sound and a new generation of sound leadership. We should know now, 22 years after democracy, that we should be less trusting of charisma and more interrogating of character. And allow me just for once to slip in a quote from Pope Francis. It's the only time I'll do it. He said, and I don't know, but it was just after his visit to the United States, not that I'm sure it had anything to do with the people there. He said, I beg the Lord to grant us more politicians who are genuinely disturbed by the state of society, by the people and the lives of the poor. So those are the three trends, the three areas that I think are impacting on the elections, and the three trends that I'm seeing in I'm surfing Christian sites. I want to, and just one more thing, in our theological tradition, the one I come from, in 1985, it's the second Catholic and the last Catholic kind of reference I made. Pope John Paul asked the International Theological Commission, to what ends should we understand things like elections? And the answer that they gave was to keep a spirit of participation alive, so that people take responsibility for their lives, and they take responsibility at the level at which they can best effect change, that it is around ensuring a culture of equality and allowing and maximizing freedom. So and I'm saying that simply because if we're going to try and understand where we cast our vote, I think it's not a bad idea to have those three goals in mind and ask who it is who allows us to maximize those virtues. I'm not sure if they're virtues, Jim. I know you're right on these things, but for me they're virtues. So, what am I using for myself as a way of trying to understand? And it's a process. I don't think I have one myself. Luke 16, 19 to 31. We all know the story. Poor Lazarus, who's at the gate of the rich man, dies, and there's this great gulf, and they can't speak to each other, and the rich man says, send him to tell my brothers, and there's that whole discussion. I find that very interesting. I really find it a very challenging scripture. And I'm only going to make 3 points. I'm always fascinated by the fact that it's only the poor man Lazarus who's named, and the rich are kind of left fairly anonymous, and what that could mean, but that's not the point for tonight. I want to make 3 points that I'm thinking about as a way of helping me understand how I should vote responsibly. The first is that the poor refuse to be invisible. He's right there, he's in your face, he can't be easily decoyed into a less visible place. He is at the front door, at the gate. And the poor are in our country refusing invisibility. They're standing up, they're saying things, they are saying, no, we don't, yes, we do. And I think when I vote, I want to ask myself the questions that I've put before you on the, what is the kind of policies that are actually going to make a difference to people's lives? Does this party that I want to vote for actually have something reasonable to say? Because I think whatever else, and I know that things have improved greatly, and I'm one of the proponents of pushing the many incredible achievements we have in this country, but really many of the achievements are on the edges, aren't they? Either the small amount who become very rich, and a significant but still small number of people who enter the middle class, and a small number, or not so small, on the other side, who come by on social grants, but not in a sustainable way. And so if the poor are knocking at our door and saying, we're not invisible, we're the people you need to do something about, you have the resources to do something about it, we are brothers and sisters in the Lord, then do something, because no one should sleep easy if the dignity and the potential and the dreams of other people are being destroyed. I've got a lovely poster at home which says, I pray for the day when the Air Force will have cake sales to buy aeroplanes, and schools will have enough money for teaching. We've got to get the economics in the service of where it'll make a difference. And the party I vote for is one that I want to be able to tick that box for. I was reading we all kind of know that Nehemiah line in chapter 2, see the trouble we are in, Jerusalem is at ruins and its gates are burned down, and we are called to restore it. The whole idea that we are menders of what is broken, not judges, and that we need to turn the fate of the city so that it will no longer be a disgrace. The second thing and so that's what I mean, who is actually doing something? Where's the track record for the poor? Where's their engagement with the poor? That's what I want to be able to satisfy myself on. The second observation that I want to take into account is the fact that the rich man was never condemned for being abusive or horrible or a cruel man. He wasn't condemned for anything he did. He was condemned for the fact that he did not use the resources he had at his disposal. And I think that is the second point that I want to look at. And there are a whole lot of things that are fitted into that. The need for repentance, the need for acknowledging that we do not use our resources in a way that heals the land, that mends the broken relationships, that offers hope, that gives food to the hungry, that clothes the naked, and that we fail in that way. And if we read that 2 Chronicles line, then we know that the repentance is linked to the healing of the nation. And so to hold that together is very important. But it does also challenge us to do justice. That we can't be secure in our personal relationship without knowing the need to act so that the impact of that relationship is felt around us. I don't know if you know that wonderful line that Rabbi Arthur Hetzberg, the American rabbi, used to say when people spoke to him in this way. He used to say, you save your soul by saving somebody else's body. And it's always kind of had a resonance with me. And so we have to work for justice. We have to understand that all those things about human rights, about respect for the institutions that enhance justice, that those things, if the party I want to vote for, I need to know values justice and values the institutions that enhance and support and maintain justice. And so that is also very important for me. And finally, it's also worth noting in that scripture that not only is it not about what the rich man did, but what he didn't do, and therefore a huge amount of introspection, but also its ramifications in the whole world of human rights. It's not only about the invisibility of the poor and our commitment to eradicating poverty, and whether the policies of a party I vote for have that in mind, if it's a stated goal. But thirdly, there's no suggestion in that scripture that Lazarus was born on the rich man's doorstep. I suspect, and the only thing I can really think, is that Lazarus asked himself, where's the best position I can be to get something that'll turn around my situation? How can I best position myself? How can I use the few things at my disposal to be in a place where I can begin to turn around my situation? And I think one of the things that, and that's the whole discussion on agency. It's the whole discussion that is so vibrant in many theological circles about the agency of the poor and the agency of the oppressed. The fact that the poor and the oppressed, they have their own dreams, they have their own ideas about their situations and the kinds of future they want. They don't always need us kind, well-meaning middle-class people to say, now what is really good for you is that you put the toilets there. We've seen this in Kailicha. The toilets were there, but they were not in the places that the people asked for, and that fight has gone on. And it's a simple matter of listening to what the poor and the people who are meant to benefit from that really believe is correct for their situation. Faith-based values and practices, Matthew 5. And then to understand that we do need to use our vote to make and to grow our contribution and to believe resolutely in the power of one, and the power we have. I've been listening on the radio to the thing they flight for Youth Month in June, where they quote Margaret Mead, who you will remember said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And then that incredibly poignant quote from Martin Luther King on the night when Rosa Parks was thrown off the bus in Montgomery, and they had a great service in the Dexter Road Church, and Martin Luther King said, I find it very poignant, he said, "Mrs. Parks was anchored to that seat by the accumulated indignities of days gone by, and by the boundless aspirations of generations yet unborn." We tied to the seat of responsible action by the indignities of years gone by, but also the unlimited aspirations of the generations to come. And we alone can make the difference, or history will judge us and find us wanting. Thank you.